The Vietnam War was not just another conflict, it was one of the deadliest and most destructive wars in human history. The scale of destruction was almost unimaginable. The United States alone dropped nearly twice as many bombs as all the forces combined in World War II. But it wasn't just bombs. Napalm, chemical agents, and relentless airstrikes left deep scars on the land, on cities, on villages, and on generations of people. Even today, the echoes of that devastation can still be felt in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Yet the story of Vietnam didn't start with America. Long before US troops set foot on its soil, French, Japanese, and Chinese forces had battled over this country. Its history was marked by repeated foreign interference, only comparable to what Afghanistan would later experience. Vietnam, however, was never merely a local fight. It became a stage for a global showdown, the battle between capitalism and communism. The United States, terrified of the domino effect spreading across Asia, saw Vietnam as a front line of the Cold War. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh and the North fought not only for national independence, but also for a vision of a communist society. And unlike any war before it, Vietnam would mark America's first major military defeat, proving that modern warfare was about far more than tanks, jets, or bombs. Morale, strategy, public opinion, and the sheer determination of a population fighting for survival often outweighed the most sophisticated weaponry. The consequences went far beyond Vietnam's borders. The war reshaped the world. It redefined US foreign policy, ended centuries of European colonial rule in Asia, shook the Bretton Woods financial system, and left a generation in the United States scarred by war, protest, and political turmoil. So how did this conflict become a global disaster, and why did the US get involved? What happened, and what were the results? Stay with us here at Histopedia, because in this video, we're going to answer all of these questions. But first, let's rewind the clock and see how it all began. Before the Americans arrived, Vietnam was already a land caught between empires. For decades, it had been part of French Indochina, a sprawling colonial territory that included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Then came World War II, and a new threat appeared. In 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, but they didn't remove the French completely. Instead, the Vichy administration stayed in place, while Japan secretly used the territory as a military base. Amid this turmoil, Ho Chi Minh emerged. A revolutionary and nationalist, he founded the Viet Minh in 1941, a movement determined to free Vietnam from foreign rule. By 1944, the Viet Minh were even receiving weapons and training from the US to fight the Japanese. Then, almost suddenly, the balance of power shifted. In March 1945, Japan ousted the French entirely and proclaimed the Empire of Vietnam, installing Emperor Bao Jai as a puppet ruler. But why did Japan act so abruptly? By that time, Japan was facing increasing pressure in the Pacific. The Allies had recaptured the Philippines and were advancing towards Japan. Supply lines were strained, and Japan needed to consolidate control in Indochina. Furthermore, the French colonial administration, loyal to Vichy France, but increasingly unreliable after the liberation of France, was suspected of preparing to side with the Allies. Tokyo could not risk being undermined from within. In response, Japan established the Empire of Vietnam under Emperor Bao Jai, aiming to win local support against both the returning French and the advancing Allies. However, this did not work, and Japan soon surrendered in August 1945, leaving a power vacuum in Vietnam. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, seized the opportunity, capturing weapons, taking control of key cities, and on the 2nd of September 1945, declaring the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Despite the surrender, Japanese troops remained in Vietnam, still armed and maintaining order. Allied forces arrived to disarm them. British and French troops reoccupied the south, while Chinese nationalists entered the north. On the 23rd of September 1945, the British supported a French coup in Saigon, toppling the Viet Minh administration and reigniting France's attempt to restore colonial rule. This marked the beginning of the First Indochina War. The conflict pitched French colonial forces against Viet Minh guerrillas, who were gaining increasing support from China and the Soviet Union. The French strategy focused on holding cities and major communication routes, believing that controlling urban centers would secure the colony. But the Viet Minh fought a different war. In the countryside, they relied on ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and the support of local populations to slowly wear down the colonial forces. By the late 1940s, what had started as a rebellion had escalated into a full-scale war. The decisive moment came in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. French commanders fortified a valley in northwestern Vietnam, hoping to lure the Viet Minh into an open battle. Instead, General Vo Nguyen Giap surrounded the garrison with tens of thousands of troops, dragged artillery through the jungle, and cut off French supply lines. The United States supported France with funding, weapons, and reconnaissance from aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin. At one point, Washington even considered tactical nuclear strikes to save the French position. Vice President Nixon wanted to get involved, but President Eisenhower, cautious after the Korean War and lacking support from Britain, refused to take action. Encircled, outnumbered, and starved of supplies, the French forces at Dien Bien Phu surrendered in May 1954. It was a humiliating defeat, ending France's colonial role in Indochina and forcing negotiations that culminated in the Geneva Conference later that year. This conference would redraw borders, reshape alliances, and set the stage for the next chapter of conflict. After months of intense negotiations, the major powers agreed to temporarily divide Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The North came under the Communist, while the South remained under a French-backed regime. A demilitarized zone was established at the dividing line, monitored by an international control commission. French troops withdrew from the north, and Viet Minh forces left the south. The agreement called for nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country, while Laos and Cambodia were recognized as independent, neutral states. This division triggered an immense migration. Over 300 days, nearly 1 million Northerners moved south, including 500,000 Catholics, 200,000 Buddhists, and tens of thousands of ethnic minorities. Meanwhile, over 100,000 Viet Minh fighters regrouped in the north, leaving 5,000 to 10,000 cadres behind in the south to organize a future insurgency. The stage was set: 2 Vietnams, 2 visions, and a brewing conflict that would draw in the world's superpowers. So how did each side position itself in this tense new landscape? In the north, Ho Chi Minh's government moved swiftly to consolidate power. Between 1953 and 1956, they carried out radical agrarian reforms, redistributing land from landlords to peasants. But this transformation was far from peaceful. The process was violent, with political purges and executions estimated between 14,000 and 50,000. By 1956, Hanoi admitted that there had been excesses and returned land to some former owners, but the reforms had already left a legacy of fear, resentment, and caution that would shape northern society for decades. In the south, power rested with Emperor Bao Jai, who appointed Ngo Dinh Diem as prime minister in 1954. A devout Catholic, anti-communist, and nationalist, Diem enjoyed strong support from the United States. His mission was clear: prevent a communist takeover in the south. By 1955, Diem had taken bold and controversial steps to solidify his control. He staged a rigged referendum to depose Bao Jai, claiming nearly 98% of the vote, a figure so implausible it even exceeded 100% in Saigon. With that, he declared the Republic of Vietnam, installing himself as president and deepening the ideological divide. He then moved quickly to consolidate control, combining reforms with ruthless repression. In 1955, he launched the Denounce the Communists campaign, which resulted in mass arrests, torture, and executions. By 1957, over 65,000 people had been imprisoned and more than 2,100 killed. By 1959, political prisoners numbered around 40,000. He also attempted limited land reform, redistributing 1.8 million acres to landless peasants and capping rice farm sizes. But the program stalled, blocked by opposition from powerful landlords. Adding to the tension, Diem dedicated the country to the Virgin Mary, alienating the Buddhist majority and creating deep social divisions. His authoritarian style, religious favoritism, and political repression polarized South Vietnam, sowing the seeds for resistance, unrest, and the eventual escalation of conflict. Those seeds quickly grew. The 5,000 to 10,000 Viet Minh cadres left behind in the South after the Geneva Agreement began quietly organizing, preparing to challenge Diem's rule. Between 1954 and 1957, while Diem maintained an outward appearance of stability, insurgent activity was slowly taking root. By April 1957, the cadres launched a targeted assassination campaign called Extermination of Traitors, striking officials and villagers allied with the French. The Chow Joc massacre in July 1957, which killed 17 people, was an early warning of the insurgency's reach. From 1957 to 1960, insurgents carried out roughly 2,000 abductions and 1,700 assassinations, with violent incidents climbing from 180 in January 1960 to 545 by September. Meanwhile, the North was methodically building the infrastructure for a larger war. In March 1956, Southern Communist leader Le Duan proposed the Road to the South, a plan to reignite insurgency, though initially opposed by China and the Soviet Union. By December 1956, Hanoi allowed limited actions, and by 1958, a unified communist command was established to coordinate the South. North Vietnamese forces also secured strategic positions in neighboring Laos. In May 1958, they captured Chapon, a crucial hub near the DMZ. By January 1959, the North Vietnamese Communist Party approved a People's War in the South, and in May 1959, Group 559 was created to upgrade the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Winding through Laos and Cambodia, the trail allowed the Viet Cong to move troops and supplies while avoiding the heavily fortified border. Despite constant U.S. bombing, the trail was repaired and expanded by thousands of workers, becoming the lifeline of the communist war effort. On 28 July 1959, North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces invaded Laos, clashing with the Royal Lao Army. Around 500 southern regroupees were sent back to the south that year, and the first arms shipments arrived in August. In April 1960, North Vietnam implemented conscription, sending roughly 40,000 soldiers into the south between 1961 and 1963. By September 1960, the North Southern Command, COSVN, coordinated uprisings that brought a third of South Vietnam's population under communist influence. In December 1960, the Viet Cong was formally established in Mamot, Cambodia, uniting insurgents, including non-communists, around removing American influence, instituting land reform, and forming a coalition government. What had begun as small pockets of resistance had now evolved into a coordinated insurgency, with the North and South locked on a collision course toward full-scale war. Meanwhile, in America, events across the globe were shaping Vietnam's future. After the 1960 presidential election, John F. Kennedy defeated Nixon and inherited a world bristling with Cold War crises: Laos, the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy was determined to contain communism, but he opposed large-scale troop deployments, leaving Diem and the ARVN to handle the growing insurgency in the South. The South Vietnamese army was poorly prepared. Plagued by weak leadership and corruption, the ARVN struggled against the Viet Cong. Their weaknesses were starkly revealed in January 1963 at the Battle of Ap Bac, where a smaller, less equipped Viet Cong force defeated a larger ARVN unit. The South lost 83 soldiers and 5 U.S. helicopters, while VC casualties were minimal. Commanders like General Huyen Van Cao had been promoted for loyalty rather than skill, prioritizing regime security over military effectiveness. Tensions at home escalated. In May 1963, the Buddhist crisis erupted after the Hugh Fat John shootings, when 9 Buddhists protesting a flag ban were killed. Widespread demonstrations condemned Diem's favoritism toward Catholics. By August, ARVN special forces loyal to Ngo Dinh Nhu raided pagodas, killing hundreds and causing widespread destruction. Alarmed by Diem's unpopularity and inability to control the insurgency, U.S. officials began planning regime change. Cable 243 instructed the American embassy to encourage a coup against Diem and Nhu. On the 2nd of November 1963, both were overthrown and executed. The removal of Diem plunged South Vietnam into chaos, creating a power vacuum that allowed Hanoi to strengthen its support for the Viet Cong. But in the middle of this turbulent situation, everything took a dramatic turn. On the 22nd of November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. His death not only shocked the United States, but also reshaped the entire course of the Vietnam conflict. Overnight, leadership passed to Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Just 2 days later, on the 24th of November, Johnson made his stance clear. America would not retreat. He invoked a powerful image that had defined U.S. foreign policy since the 1950s, the domino theory. The idea was simple. If South Vietnam fell to communism, it would set off a chain reaction across Asia. Like a row of dominoes toppling one after another, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and even Indonesia could collapse into the communist camp, and from there, perhaps India, perhaps Japan, perhaps the entire Pacific. But while Johnson was firm on strategy, the reality on the ground was grim. South Vietnam was in turmoil. The Military Revolutionary Council under General Duong Van Minh proved indecisive and ineffective. In January 1964, General Nguyen Khan staged yet another coup, one of many that destabilized the fragile state. In less than 2 years, South Vietnam had gone from a dictatorship under Diem to a revolving door of generals, none capable of commanding legitimacy. For Johnson, this turmoil was unacceptable. He became convinced that only direct American intervention could prevent disaster. And then came the event that changed everything, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, on the 4th of August, a second attack was reported, an attack that, decades later, was proven never to have happened. But at the time, Johnson seized on the incident. On 7th August 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president authority to take all necessary measures to repel aggression. In practice, it was a blank check, allowing Johnson to escalate the war without a formal declaration. From that moment, the U.S. role changed irreversibly, and just like that, America was fully immersed in Vietnam. By early 1965, the United States shifted from advising to direct combat. The first U.S. Marines landed in Da Nang, officially marking the beginning of America's ground war in Vietnam. That same month, Operation Rolling Thunder began, a relentless bombing campaign aimed at crippling North Vietnam's infrastructure and severing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Yet, despite hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, the trail endured, constantly repaired, expanded, and defended by tens of thousands of workers. It remained the lifeline of the insurgency. As U.S. involvement deepened, the ARVN continued to falter under corruption and poor leadership. In contrast, the Viet Cong adapted quickly, using ambushes, hit-and-run strikes, and deadly booby traps to keep the countryside in turmoil. America brought firepower, the communists countered with patience and resilience. By 1966 to 1967, U.S. forces swelled past 500,000 troops. Battles such as Ia Drang Valley in late 1965 showcased the raw power of American helicopters, artillery, and airstrikes, but also the determination of the North Vietnamese army, which refused to break. Each fight drained resources and morale, while guerrilla attacks in the countryside weakened the already limited authority of the Saigon government. On paper, the U.S. was winning, holding cities, killing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, and controlling the skies. But beneath the statistics, cracks were forming. Washington had underestimated both the political weakness of the South and the sheer willpower of the North. And then, in 1968, everything changed with the Tet Offensive. In late January, during the Vietnamese New Year, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces unleashed a coordinated assault on more than 100 cities and towns, including Saigon itself and the historic city of Hue. Militarily, the offensive was a disaster for Hanoi. The Viet Cong suffered enormous casualties, losing tens of thousands of fighters. Yet, strategically, it was a masterstroke. Tet shattered the image of American progress. For the first time, U.S. audiences watched live on television as enemy forces struck at the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon and occupied Hue for weeks. The message was clear. If the United States had poured in 500,000 troops, launched relentless bombing campaigns, and still could not prevent such a widespread attack, then perhaps victory was impossible. The Johnson administration's credibility collapsed overnight. Reports that America was winning the war now rang hollow. Public support plunged, anti-war protests grew louder, and the conflict that had once seemed distant now tore apart American society itself. For President Johnson, Tet was the breaking point. In March 1968, he made a shocking announcement. He would not seek re-election. The Vietnam War had consumed his presidency. In 1968, Richard Nixon swept into power after one of the easiest elections in American history, promising to bring peace with honor to a war that had already torn his nation apart. But Nixon knew peace would not come quickly. His strategy, called Vietnamization, was meant to shift the burden of combat to the ARVN while gradually pulling U.S. troops out. By the early 1970s, American troop numbers dropped sharply, but U.S. air power only grew. Entire regions were engulfed in flames as bombers hammered North Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, and even neutral Cambodia. At the same time, Nixon was playing a different game, a geopolitical chessboard. He opened the door to China and eased tensions with the Soviet Union, hoping to isolate Hanoi from its two great communist patrons. For a moment, it seemed as if diplomacy might break the deadlock. But in 1972, North Vietnam answered with fury. The Easter Offensive, a massive invasion with tanks, artillery, and tens of thousands of soldiers, roared into South Vietnam. This was no longer guerrilla warfare, it was conventional war, fought with the weapons of modern armies. The ARVN struggled, and it was only with overwhelming U.S. bombing and new precision-guided weapons that the offensive was pushed back. The message was clear. Without America, South Vietnam could not survive. Meanwhile, at home, the United States was breaking apart. The war was draining not just the treasury, but the very soul of the nation. Protests exploded in the streets, Congress slashed funding, and Nixon himself was dragged down by the Watergate scandal. Finally, in January 1973, the long-awaited Paris Peace Accords were signed. A ceasefire was declared. American prisoners were released. U.S. troops withdrew. Officially, for America, the war was over. But in Vietnam, it was only the beginning of the end. From 1973 to 1975, South Vietnam stood alone. Its army still had U.S. weapons, but not U.S. soldiers. Corruption, weak leadership, and collapsing morale hollowed it from within, while the North rebuilt, rearmed, and prepared its final strike. That strike came in March 1975. North Vietnamese forces stormed across the Central Highlands, and the ARVN collapsed almost instantly. Entire cities crumbled without a fight falling in rapid succession. Panic spread, refugees flooded the roads, and the South unraveled in weeks. By April 30th, 1975, Saigon itself was surrounded. North Vietnamese tanks smashed through the gates of the presidential palace, and the war that had consumed a generation was finally over. The last Americans were lifted from the U.S. Embassy rooftop by helicopter in scenes broadcast around the world. Vietnam was now united under communist rule as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. But how did the United States, a superpower with unmatched firepower, wealth, and technology, lose to a small, war-torn nation in Southeast Asia? The answer is not simple. It was a convergence of military miscalculations, political failures, and social fractures. On the battlefield, the U.S. military was designed for decisive, conventional wars of tanks, artillery, and sweeping maneuvers. Vietnam offered none of that. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong refused to fight on American terms. They mastered guerrilla warfare, ambushes, booby traps, and tunnel networks that allowed them to disappear and re-emerge at will. Dense jungles and rice paddies became weapons in themselves, swallowing up high-tech firepower and turning American patrols into vulnerable targets. Search and destroy missions might clear an area for a day, but once the U.S. left, the Viet Cong returned. The war became a cycle with no victory in sight. Meanwhile, Washington's ally, the South Vietnamese government, was collapsing from within. Corruption was rampant, leadership weak, and policies often alienated the very rural peasants whose support was essential. Instead of winning hearts and minds, Saigon's rulers pushed more villagers into the arms of the Viet Cong. America could send weapons, money, and advisors, but it could not manufacture legitimacy. Back in the United States, another war was being fought, one of perception. The Tet Offensive of 1968 revealed to the American public that the enemy was far stronger and more resilient than official reports had claimed. Confidence crumbled. The My Lai massacre, napalm-stricken villages, and the sight of coffins returning home eroded support even further. For the first time in U.S. history, public opinion became as decisive as battles overseas. Finally, the greatest miscalculation of all, the underestimation of North Vietnam's will. Hanoi was prepared to endure decades of bombing, famine, and unimaginable loss to achieve national unification. For them, it was existential. For the U.S., it was a distant conflict filtered through elections, media coverage, and public outrage. America had the weapons, but not the patience to fight a war without end. And of course, this had enormous consequences. By April 30th, 1975, Saigon had fallen, and Vietnam was united under communist rule. The human cost was staggering. Over 2 million civilians, Hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides and more than 58,000 Americans had died. Millions more were wounded or displaced, villages destroyed, farmland poisoned, and forests scarred by Agent Orange, leaving lasting health and environmental damage. Politically, Vietnam began major communist reform. Neighboring Laos and Cambodia were also destabilized, with Cambodia descending into civil war and genocide under the Khmer Rouge. For the United States, the war shattered public trust, divided society, and fueled anti-war movements that reshaped politics and culture. The War Powers Act of 1973 sought to prevent unchecked military action, while the so-called Vietnam Syndrome influenced U.S. foreign policy for years. Economically, the costs were enormous. Vietnam's infrastructure lay in ruins, and the U.S. had spent over $150 billion, straining resources and fueling inflation. These expenditures contributed to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, weakening the dollar and destabilizing global finance. Socially and psychologically, the war left deep scars. Veterans and civilians suffered trauma, including what we now recognize as PTSD, and Vietnamese society bore divisions that lasted generations. But now, it's your turn. What do you think? Was this war a game changer in history? What were the mistakes? And did we learn anything from it? We'll be reading your comments. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Here at Histopedia, we bring you new videos every week, diving deep into the events that shaped our world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. We hope to see you again soon.